Okay.
Yeah. So live. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Islam, and I'm the current UHMSA president, and I'll be the host for today. And our guest for today is Ali Harfouch. Ali Harfouch obtained his master's degree in political studies from the American University of Beirut. He is the author of Against the World Towards an Islamic Liberation Philosophy, as well as more than a dozen articles. He specializes in political philosophy and politics in the Muslim world. He is also a writer for Ummatics and Sapiens Institute, and he is also one of the writers of the Genealogy of Modernities. Welcome, brother Harfouch. Jazakallah khair for coming on. It's an exciting moment for us. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So I want to start by if you could tell us a little bit about your background. I think so people understand, okay, where is this coming from? It helps them understand the idea and helps them connect it in a way.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So it really started. My interest in these topics really started when I moved to Lebanon in 2008. So I grew up in the United States in the suburbs. My parents are Lebanese, and the orientation on my father's side of the family, they're leftist. Okay, so we were always there. I grew up always being exposed to political discussions, and I grew up having a very deep interest in politics. In particular, when I started practicing Islam in Islamic politics. So I moved to Beirut and I enrolled in the American University of Beirut, and immediately I became active with several Islamic movements, different movements at different times as my thought began to evolve, and at the same time I was active on campus. So there was this intersection between the ideals of Islamic movements, and their founders, which we are well exposed to, Maududi, Qutb, Nabahani, Banna, and others. And at the same time, I'm engaging with intellectuals and academics on campus. So from that experience, especially being on the ground with these Islamic movements and also being exposed to people like Enrique Dussel, Paulo Freire, um, and others, multiple other thinkers, um, I began to formulate these ideas. And what I came to believe is that the Islamic movements, and especially the Muslim diaspora and Muslims in the West, Muslims in the global North, lack a more liberatory understanding of our core commitment, which is Tawheed. So that's why. So basically, it culminates in me writing these articles and in me publishing this book. So that's just the gist of it.
I mean, you speak about liberation. I think everybody has been mentioning liberation with what's happening
Hmm.
in Syria and their mention of Palestine. And
Yeah.
what is the Islamic definition of liberation?
So in Islam, we have a very specific understanding of liberation, which is distinct from the liberal understandings of liberation. Now, the problem is that liberalism has hijacked and appropriated what it means to be free and understandings of liberation, and you have the post-colonial discourse and the nationalist discourse, which also tries to appropriate what is liberation. Now, what all of these narratives share is that they're secular. They're secular to their core, right? Now, Muslims, if we go back to the Quran and our own metaphysical commitments, such as Tawheed, we have our own understanding of liberation, which is recognizing not our absolute autonomy and individuality, but recognize our contingency and our relationship to the absolute creator, to the uniquely transcendent creator. And in doing so, in recognizing our relationship to the creator, we maintain a sense of independence and autonomy, right, from political, economic, and social oppressive structures. So this is the understanding in Islam, the Tawheedic understanding of liberation, that through recognizing our covenant with God, we recognize that all other cognitives and social contracts are contingent, historical, and relative, and in some cases completely illegitimate.
Hmm. Okay, so you've mentioned of you've mentioned how it is connected to Tawheed in a certain way. How is Tawheed
Mhm.
then connected to the Islamic liberation in that sense?
So
And how do you define Tawheed in this case?
So Tawheed, if we look at so the idea of Tawheed, it is twofold, right? When we say the Shahada, Tawheed is embodied in the Shahada,
Mhm.
and it is embodied in La ilaha illallah. So La ilaha illallah is both a negation and an affirmation. The negation, La ilaha, is a negation of all false gods, right? The negation of fetishization being the process wherein something becomes a god through the hands of man, the consciousness of man. So Tawheed is the negation of false gods, and in our age, the global liberal system, global capitalism, and the tawaghit, right? The false idols that authoritarian structures in the Muslim world, and illallah is the affirmation of the unique transcendence of God, but not only that, recognizing the transcendence of God in the sense that He is singular and absolute, but also recognizing the lordship of God, meaning that God not only possesses cosmic sovereignty in the sense that He's the creator, but He also possesses temporal and historical sovereignty, which we recognize through the Sharia and through our covenant with God and by emulating the Sunnah of the Prophet.
Mm. Okay. So, يعني, today, what are, and we mentioned liberation, right? And Tawheed, like, then Tawheed, what does it liberate us from, يعني, in a sense, today? Is it,
Mhm.
what is it? Do we have secularism? Is it like the liberal framework? Is it?
So, okay, this is a very good question. Now, the problem is this. Okay, first of all, let me take a step back and clarify something. That when we say Tawheed, we're not just talking about a philosophy that can engage with secular philosophy. Tawheed is also a praxis. It's also a mode of action. Okay, so when we engage in a critique of secular narratives and secular political structures, such as global capitalism, neoliberalism, authoritarianism, uh, the tribalism that's prevalent in the United States between the left and the right, we're not just talking about philosophical critiques, which is important, but we're also talking about modes of actions, and these modes of actions must translate into concrete strategies. Now, Tawheed, what we need to do as youth, especially in the global north, is translate this idea of Tawheed as liberatory and our own philosophical commitment and our own worldview, translate it into critiques of these different
Mm.
philosophies: secularism, liberalism, the left, the emergent left, and socialist discourse and narratives, and of course neoliberalism and global capitalism and whatnot. So Tawheed and our worldview ought to address these different philosophies and these different narratives. And this is the task of, in my opinion, this is the task of the Muslim youth and the intelligentsia that's emerging across the Muslim world.
Okay. So Islam as a liberatory movement, in a sense, like, what constitutes a liberatory movement? Like, what makes Islam the liberatory movement?
Okay, so what makes a movement a liberatory movement?
Mm-hmm.
When its core philosophy maintains a sense of independence and autonomy from the prevailing oppressive structure. Why is this important? Because that philosophy cultivates a consciousness which can identify oppressive structures as being not natural and not normal and not representative of the good life. And so this consciousness is critical of those structures. So, in order for a movement to be liberatory, it needs a liberatory philosophy, and that liberatory philosophy again must be conscious raising, right? It must give birth to a critical consciousness, um, and which is critical of the hegemonic oppressive order. Now, Tawheed in particular, what Tawheed does is it grounds our political critical consciousness, which we find in Marxism and decolonial thought and whatnot. But Tawheed the Islamic worldview takes it a step further, where it grounds critical consciousness in metaphysics, right? In an understanding of God, in an understanding of reality in the cosmos. In particular, understanding the reality in the cosmos as being contingent and finite, right? And only God being absolute and being the ultimate, being the uniquely transcendent. So this is why Islam and Tawheed fits into the narrative, meets the conditions of a liberatory philosophy. If not, it is the ultimate liberatory philosophy.
Hmm. So, okay. So, in regards to the liberatory movement, I think one of the main things that you spoke about the liberatory movement is it constitutes the alterity of man, right? How do you define alterity in this case, and what are some
Okay,
examples of
yeah.
the alterity of man?
Okay, that's a very good question. So, alterity of man, right, refers to a state in which man, through his consciousness and his actions, through his thinking and his actions, maintains a relation of independence from the prevailing hegemonic structures,
Mhm.
especially the oppressive structures. So this is what alterity is, and of course, there's certain conditions you need to maintain that alterity. Um, for example, understanding your relationship to God, understanding that only God is the absolute, that these systems are not absolute, or understanding that you have an original covenant, a primordial covenant with God, and that these social contracts and these covenants with the oppressive that are imposed upon us by the oppressive orders are finite and illegitimate. Now, examples of alterity is the prophetic movement in Mecca, right? Immediately, Surah Al-Kafirun was one of the first surahs revealed. There was a disassociation with the prevailing structures at the time, the prevailing culture, right? Um, Same thing with a lot of the Islamic movements that emerged in the Muslim world, right? The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Jama'at al-Islami in Pakistan, uh, among others, and the Syrian revolutionary movement in 2011, 2012, uh, the early days of the Egyptian revolution, and so forth. They maintained a sense of alterity to the prevailing structures. Now, some of the more secular movements attempted to do this by committing to certain values and ideals that transcend or that have been negated by the oppressive structures, such as democracy, the dignity of man, and whatnot. But the problem is they did not have a coherent worldview to ground those values in, and they remained committed to a global secular narrative that they were not able to transcend. Whereas in Islam, we maintain our alterity through what I already said, which is that our fundamental relationship is with God. We begin our very existence, our very essence and being is contingent onto our being created by God, and that we are in a covenant with God, and that God is the Lord. He is the Rabb, meaning He is involved in our affairs, right? In addition to God's legislative sovereignty and whatnot. So that is why we maintain that Tawheed cultivate a critical consciousness um, uh, vis-a-vis the prevailing structures.
Mhm. Uh, that's it's very interesting how you mentioned that the rest of the thoughts and the rest of the movements, they're still like limited by the secular system, right? And how does that, why and Islam, how why is Islam different in this case particularly?
For several reasons. First and foremost, that the Quran furnishes a very distinct uh, uh, set of metaphysics, its own worldview, especially in the Quran, right? So when the Quran was revealed, it inaugurated a radical rupture with the existing regimes of knowledge, the existing epistemologies and existing worldviews. How? By redefining the nature of our understanding of God, redefining our understanding of the cosmos, reality as a whole, and redefining our understanding of what is man, the individual self and the collective self. Um, Now, secularism, of course, there's different secular narratives, but secularism can, up until today, if we look at, for example, liberal discourse, Marxist discourse, and so forth, it has been unable to furnish a distinct and sustainable and understanding of the individual. So, for example, even liberalism, which is premised and grounded in the idea of the individual, lacks a coherent understanding. And of course, there's differences within the liberal camp, understanding of what is the individual, um, what is consciousness, what is the relationship of man to the cosmos, what is the relationship of man to the absolute. Uh, does man have is man made of a duality? Does he have a soul, or is he purely a rational, calculating, consuming being, right? Who makes rational decisions? Of course, this is a myth with regards to economic calculations and whatnot. Um, So time has shown, and history has shown, that these secular narratives have been unable to furnish an understanding of reality, God, and the cosmos, and man.
So it's almost like they're limited. They don't have some sort of exteriority, right? In a sense,
Yes,
like
yes,
they don't have something that
yes.
grounds them outside of the hegemony.
Exactly, exactly. And this is one of the things that I stress in my book, that if your philosophy is not grounded in exteriority, which means something that is independent of a structure, then you are bound to be imprisoned to a certain system or a certain totality. Now, in this case, in the case of secularism, because it is not grounded in the exteriority of God, the recognition of God, right? It is ultimately, and this is the essence of secularism, it is grounded in the sovereignty of the world, rendering the world to be absolute. So the temporal world becomes a pantheon for idolatry. And so this is the main pitfall of secularism. And this ought to be our point of critique from the Tawhidic point of view of secularism.
So I think with this point, you mentioned in the book second creators. How do you define it
Mhm.
in this context? What role does it
So,
play?
so I get this from Sherman B. Jackson. So basically, a second creator refers to, so the first creator refers to that being, that ultimate being, which created the primordial self, right? Created man out of ex nihilo, created man out of nothingness, created the cosmos. Second creators are creators that attempt to create new social, political, and economic realities and present those realities as though they are normal and natural, right? As though they define reality in and of itself, as though they are absolute and transhistorical and whatnot.
Mm. Okay, so with that, يعني, then I want to look. I want to move to the Quran, and I want to see like how does the Quran um affect our activism? Like, what are the themes of the Quran that make us move towards liberation? Where is this encouraged? Where do we gain this understanding of Islam being a liberatory
Excellent.
movement?
Very good. So okay, in several senses. So first of all, as I said earlier, that any movement, any liberatory movement, such as I believe Islam is a liberatory movement in and of itself, requires a liberatory philosophy, and Tawheed provides a philosophy. How? By grounding our consciousness in a certain understanding of God, man, and the cosmos. Now, uh, these concepts, this new metaphysics, and this consciousness was revealed through the Quran. So if you look at the Quran, if you look at the verses of the Quran, the content of the Quran, the narratives of the Quran, um, it is consciousness forming, right? It cultivates its critical consciousness. And this is very evident in the Quranic generation that emerged from Mecca. So, for example, if we were to take one instance of this, if we look at the ways in which the Quran tells the early Muslims, reflect on such and such signs, it does not tell them reflect on these signs in isolation, but it always relates them to a cosmic order that is that is contingent in its relationship onto God, right? The Quran also constantly cultivates a certain understanding of what is our relationship to God. That not only is God the creator, but He's also the Rabb, He is the Lord, meaning He is actively involved in our affairs. So the Quran, in terms of its content and its pedagogy, it cultivates a critical consciousness. Now, today, what we need to do as Islamic movements and Muslim students in the global north and the global south is, okay, go back to the Quran and try to say, like, okay, what is this liberatory philosophy and what does it mean for us in terms of modes of action and strategies, right? Strategies on the local, national, or domestic level, and strategies on the more global level. And I stress global level because we live in an interconnected world. There's no more, it's very difficult nowadays to, for example, speak of Muslims in Egypt versus Muslims in the United States. Everything has become interconnected. There's a global, especially with social media and the prevalence of the internet culture and whatnot. So yeah, this is the way in which the Quran cultivates this philosophy and this critical consciousness.
So what about ummah? How does the concept of an ummah contribute? How, like, the concept of ummah going beyond nationalism, going beyond all the symbols that have been created in today's time, how does it contribute to this alterity and exteriority and this liberatory mindset here?
Very good. So the word ummah, the etymology of the word ummah stems from the word uh, right, which means to have a certain direction and destination. Okay. So the word ummah is not a static, does not refer to some kind of static national tribal identity, right? It refers to an active identity that is grounded in a certain set of metaphysical commitments and a certain worldview, which is tawheed. Now, given that the ummah uh, was received its signification, and its worldview, and its relationship vis-a-vis other communities from God, it naturally maintains an alterity to other communities and to global structures, domestic structures, authoritarian structures, and so forth. That's one. Second of all, God, Allah Azza wa Jal, delegates onto the Ummah a certain ontological vocation, a certain ontological responsibility, which is an istikhlaf, stewardship on earth, right? So this role that man has in the world, in the cosmos, that the Ummah has, right, gives it a sense of alterity. So the Ummah maintains an alterity in terms of its consciousness, its philosophy, right? Its tawheed, its culture, its sunnah, and so forth. But it also maintains an alterity in its responsibility and its function um, in the world. And this is precisely what we need to recapture, because what the nation state has done, it has dismembered the ummah, or liberalism. It has dismembered the ummah into individuals, an aggregate, a massive individuals. Therefore, we are not able to uptake this collective task of al-istikhlaf. So what we need to do is we need to revive this proper understanding of ummah, the ummatic paradigm, and then try to understand, like, okay, what does this mean for us in today's global village? What does this mean for us in relation to neoliberalism, prevalent neoliberalism, and the emergent right wing across Europe and the United States? What does it mean for us as an ummah?
So you mentioned liberalism, and in this case, how has liberalism affected the worldview? Like, what is the liberalism? How has liberalism defined politics and our understanding of politics nowadays? Because some people say, "Oh, I'm not gonna be engaged in politics. There's something that is just it's not my thing." In this case, and has liberalism caused this to happen, where people uh, uh, like differentiate between politics and the rest of the da'wah scene and the rest of the deen and the tawheed and
Yes, definitely. I mean, liberalism is one of the ultimate expressions and the newest expression of the narratives of secularism, right? Which is essentially the sovereignty of the world, the sovereignty of the dunya, right? The sovereignty of that which is temporal, historical, contingent, uh, and from the Tawhidic point of view, something which is in a perpetual state of annihilation, right? Something which is uh, temporal, right? In the negative sense, right? So what liberalism does is, instead of understanding the world as being uh, temporary and finite, um, it understands the world as being some kind of sublime absolute ends of man. And that is how it legitimizes its individualism and the autonomy of the individual, where the individual becomes his own God. Now, when the individual becomes his own God, his hubris, he becomes blinded to other realities, such as the reality of transcendence, his relationship to God, his relationship to the community, certain ideals and certain virtues and whatnot. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, obviously, it's the idea that liberalism is the idea of disassociating religion from politics. To do so, it arbitrarily has to define what is politics and what is religion. So it's not just that liberalism separates religion from politics, but more insidiously, it defines what is politics and it defines what is religion. So we find, and this is very prevalent and now mainstream, that liberals are attempting to define what is Islam, and and for them it's essentially a market Islam, right? An Islam of the market. Um, so this is the ways in which, and this is a very subtle form of secularization. This is a very, and this is very dangerous, right? Because things are so certain consumerism, a certain quote unquote Muslim consumerism is presented as an Islamic lifestyle, but it is in reality subservience to a consumerist culture, which is liberalism. In addition to um, being dismembering the ummah, right, into a set of individuals. Now, when you think of your aspirations and your scope of action as an individual, you're obviously very limited. So you can't do much, right? But when you understand that you are part of an ummah, a global ummah, obviously things change. Liberalism does not let you think as an ummah, it makes you think as an individual. And even the individual that is supposedly dignified and liberated in liberalism is, in fact, um, degenerated and rendered into something that has become subhuman. And we find this in now with the emergence of trans culture and whatnot. So this is what liberalism has done to the individual.
I mean, then how does this how does this look like on the leftist point of view? Like, what differentiates us from the leftist point of view? So there is a growing, especially in the Middle East, especially here in the United States, there's a growing leftist trend almost that where they use the left and the leftist ideas and ideals as the framework for activism, right? So what
Yeah.
is our framework of Islamic activism, and how is it different from them,
Mhm.
and like this relation
That's a
to the
very good.
ummah?
Yeah, this is a very good point. And I think this is a problem, especially for Muslims in the West. So the problem is that we feel as though, as Muslims in the West, we feel as though we must commit to one of two camps, um, especially because both camps, the left and the right, have certain elements that appeal to Muslims. So, for example, the right is more conservative in terms of family values and so forth. The left is, uh, you know, nominally anti-Islamophobic. Of course, they're only against that because they have a certain understanding of what is Islam, right, and whatnot. They won't. They'd be very also just as hostile to other forms of Islam. They'd be much just as Islamophobic to authentic Orthodox Islam. But anyways, so this is why, because people are lost between these two commitments. So they feel that they must subscribe to one camp. So if they're anti-Islamophobic, the Muslim is anti-Islamophobic, obviously, then he must commit to everything that the leftist camp says. Or if he is a conservative, if he believes in conservative understanding of the family unit, then he must commit to all the left, the right wing and whatnot. What we ought to do is try to cultivate our own culture and our own understanding of certain issues and of course policies in a culture, and this culture ought to be grounded in our Quran, right, and the Sunnah of our Prophet. And I feel as though this is something that young Muslims, especially across college campuses, are beginning to understand, they're starting to be bold enough to do this, right? Now, trying to remember the rest of your question. Um, yes. So now, what is the philosophy of the left? The reality is that they don't have a coherent philosophy, right? It is more of a commitment to certain issues, right? So the left that exists today is not like the left of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and so forth, even the 1990s. It is not grounded in, a Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism and whatnot. No, the leftist philosophy is much more shallow. It is more about committing to certain issues, and um, uh, 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 and so this is one of the reasons, right, why it is very difficult to engage uh, rationally or in a civilized in a civil manner with certain people in the left, because they don't have a coherent grounding that they can reason from, that they can reason on the basis of. It is purely a tribal commitment to certain issues, right? Transgender rights and other issues, um, and whatnot. So, and this makes it difficult for us to try to critique leftist discourse, because there's nothing really there of substance to critique and whatnot. So, and but at the same time, this is not to say that the leftist camp is evil, right? As right wing populists try to represent them as, because when somebody says most people, when they say I belong to the left, right, it is not so much a commitment to Marxism or dialectical materialism or whatever. It is more, or class struggle. It is more of a sense of recognizing the evils of capitalism. So people think that if you want to reject capitalism, the only alternative is the left, right? So this is really why the left also appeals to a lot of young people.
Yeah, so I mean that's the framework that they're coming from. That's the paradigms they use are from the left to actually reject capitalism and the evils of the right wing. But how does it look like for us, like as Muslim activists? What are the frameworks that we are using that are different from the left in this case?
The problem is that up until now we have not developed a coherent framework,
Hmm.
and we have not developed our own culture in the West, right? Our own distinct culture, and this is for numerous reasons, historical and whatnot. Um, so we don't really have a framework, and because we don't have a framework, we can't really definitively identify our position on certain issues, right? And we can't mobilize Muslims around those issues. Now, this is beginning to change. This is beginning to change. Of course, there's certain obstacles with the emergence of Donald Trump and Muslims being divided in terms of Donald Trump, as when Donald Trump came to define the Republican Party and the right wing movement in the United States. Um, Things became more complicated for Muslims in the West. But that being said, I feel as if we are beginning to move towards uh, cultivating a certain culture. It's not there yet, but we're beginning to move there. And so, for example, people like Imam Omar Suleiman, right? His stance on LGBTQ in Yaqeen, very clear, very traditional, very bold, right? No watering down the issue. Same thing with Sheikh Yasir Qadi in terms of his relation, uh, how we ought to live with non-Muslims and live with other communities, but at the same time maintain our own authenticity and our own tradition. So this is emerging, and this is a very positive thing. It remains to be seen how it evolves, but of course, this is the task at hand of Muslims in the West, cultivating that culture grounded in the Quran, through which we can define our stance on certain issues. And it's only when we have that framework that we can positively engage with the left and with the right.
So my understanding of the framework is that the center of it is Tawheed as a practice. Tawheed not just as an understanding, and I think you mentioned that a lot in your book. Tawheed not just as an understanding, but Tawheed as an action and as a movement. And and how does this connect? Yani, is da'wah, for example, considered Islamic activism in a way where it is liberatory, just the introduction of Islam to people? Is it in a, are we liberating people by introducing them to Islam? Is that the?
Of course, that's a part of it,
Mhm.
right? Introducing people to Islam, that's a fundamental part of it. But that's not enough. Like if we look at the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't just go around he went to individuals and he went to the communities, introducing them to Islam, telling them about the prayer and the zakat and whatnot. But as a movement, they were constantly in a perpetual struggle against Quraysh, right, and whatnot. Um, so yes, da'wah to non-Muslims, that's essential. That is fundamental, and that involves doing more research into secularism, liberalism, Americanism, and whatnot. That's very important. Feminism, LGBTQ, and whatnot, so that we can engage with them in a way, because Islam, you can't introduce Islam in the abstract. You have to introduce Islam vis-a-vis certain issues and prevailing discourses and whatnot. Um, but at the same time, we have to recapture dawah as a liberatory movement. But again, also dawah as a liberatory movement cannot be understood in the abstract. It's not merely a philosophy that exists on campuses or in academia. We must understand. We must begin to ask questions such as, okay, if Tawheed uh, uh, liberates us from oppressive structures, okay, let's be more concrete. So how does it liberate us from Americanism, right-wing populism, global neoliberalism, authoritarianism, and so forth. This is an intellectual. This is a intellectual exercise which again requires, of course, a critical consciousness and an understanding of our own worldview. Which is again, so this is, I believe, the task. This is one of the tasks at hand, and we can build on the shoulders of giants because there is a caravan of pioneers who have done this, who have began this before us.
So the pioneers who have started this before us like include, is Islamic activism like something scholarly, or is it something that's developed outside of it's not something the scholars would do?
No. See, actually, this is a misconception. Certain quote unquote traditional Muslims, uh, now, because now you have this the emergence of this quote unquote traditional Islam, when whatnot, that attempt to be orthodox, whatever. They try to talk about Islamism as being activism, as being Islamism, and Islamism as being essentially emerging from intellectuals and whatnot. That's not true, because some of the key leaders of Islamic movements were scholars. For example, Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, Israr Ahmad, I believe, Israr Ahmad, Nabahani. And even the Muslim Brotherhood that was founded by Hassan al-Banna, the core founders were scholars from Al-Azhar and whatnot. So these movements were scholarly movements. Same thing across North Africa. These Islamic movements emerged from scholars, and even contemporary movements. For example, the Syrian Revolution. It was backed from the very early days by scholars who were guiding the rebels in terms of like, okay, um, um, uh, uh, giving it a direction and maintaining its Islamicity and so forth. So it's incorrect. It would be blatantly and factually incorrect to say that the movement is not scholarly or does not have scholarly origins.
Okay, so I think I want to switch it a little bit, and I want to go to the oppressed and نصر المستضعفون في الأرض, like that's what you mentioned in the book, and I would love if you expand on Islam's role in helping the oppressed, and how
Very
do we
good. Very
develop
good.
that understanding?
Very good. Very good. So okay. So the first step, the first imperative in liberating the oppressed is to make them aware that they are oppressed. The second step is to make them aware why are they oppressed. Third, how do they liberate themselves from that oppression? So in order to understand, in order to become conscious that you are oppressed, you need to come to the realization, the awakening, that these structures that subvert you, right, are not natural structures, are not legitimate structures, are not historical absolute structures, right? Rather, they are historical, contingent, relative, and illegitimate. And this realization comes through numerous things, comes through numerous uh, in numerous ways, channels. For example, understanding what does it mean to be a human. So understanding that, for example, and this is what led to the revolutions across Africa, Latin America, and whatnot. They began to real Frantz Fanon and so forth, especially Frantz Fanon, for example, that I am not a subhuman because I am black. I am an individual. I am a human being. I am fully human. So this white supremacist structure that subverts me because of my blackness, it is an illegitimate structure. Now, the second step is to understand why are you oppressed? And this is where you begin to understand what is the logic and the philosophy behind the oppressive order. What are the narratives it perpetuates? So, for example, the superiority of white culture, or these the nat that capitalism is natural and it represents a natural order of things, and that in order for you, and that the individual is made a rational being that calculates his individual interests and so forth. And then the third level, the third step of liberating the oppressed, is to understand how they liberate themselves, right? What are the mechanisms and so forth. Now, I've already mentioned this earlier, so I'll try to just talk about the gist of it. Now, how does Islam do this? Is that, again, it cultivates an understanding of, it makes people aware that they are oppressed by redefining what does it mean to be man. what does it mean to be an individual, right? That man is dignified. Man is not to be degraded. Man is an indignified being, right? Who was dignified by God and not by some kind of social contract. That man has a sublime relationship with God, an authentic relationship with God, and that man has a relationship to an ummah that transcends uh, the domesticated social context. And then the Quran also reveals, in terms of understanding why you are oppressed. So the Quran does not only affirm what is man, what is relationship to God, but it also introduces us to what is not Islam. And so this is where the Quran, for example, expounds on the idea of jahiliyyah to try to let us understand what is a philosophy that undergirds all of these oppressive narratives. And then it gives us a way of moving out of um, oppression, right? Through our own understanding of politics, our own understanding of uh, uh, legitimacy, political, economic, social legitimacy, by furnishing our own understanding of the collective, our own understanding of identity, our own sense of law, right, which is the Sharia and so forth. So this is the gist of it.
So I think to give it like a more concrete, how did the Prophet ﷺ do that? Like, what are these steps we find in the seerah? Where like, okay, I made them aware, and then I make them understand why they're oppressed, and then the strategic part of actually breaking the shackles of oppression. What does that
Yeah.
look like in the seerah?
Okay. So that's a good question. So generally, right, we know that the scholars divided the Quran into Meccan and Medinian surahs. So the Meccan surah is more, let's say, for lack of a word, ideological. So in Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ, through the Quran, he was the let's say the vessel of the Quran, right? Um, uh, he began by introducing a radically distinct worldview, a radically different worldview, philosophy, a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding the self, a way of understanding the collective, but primarily a way of understanding God. Because our understanding of God defines our understanding of man, cosmos, nature, politics, and so forth. So the Quran, through the Prophet, introduced this radically different understanding of Tawheed, of God and man and so forth, a new understanding of it. So essentially, what the Prophet did, and this is why the Quraysh was so antagonistic to the Prophet, he inaugurated a rupture with the prevailing culture in Quraysh in every sense. Political sense, economic sense, cultural sense, epistemological sense in terms of the sources of knowledge and whatnot. Um, and he began to cultivate a community that is committed and grounded, committed and ground. Of course, it has to be this concrete commitment, right? Commitment to death, to these new ideas, to this new worldview, which is Tawheed, La ilaha illallah, and whatnot. And then, in order to uh, 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 solidify, let's say, or maintain the purity of this new worldview, right? The coherence of this world. Let's say coherence. That's a better word. The coherence of this worldview. Um, there was an open disassociation with Quraysh, for example, in Surah Al-Kafirun, right? Complete disassociation. And then, in order, of course, to the ultimate manifestation um, of this radical departure and this cultivation of a new culture, right, was with the hijrah when he went to Medina. So this philosophy, this new worldview, is now expressed in a social, political, economic, and cultural reality, which is Medina, right? Um, and that's why in Medina, in the Quran, the more legislative verses were revealed. Now, I like this question because one of the tasks at hand when we try to understand our role as Muslims in understanding Tawheed is to try to go back to the Sirah and say, like, okay, what can we glean from the Sirah in terms of our, let's say, our political activism in the West or in the global South and whatnot, right? Or because scholars in the past, they rarely approach the Sirah in the abstract, right? They always approach certain so, for example, the sira in relation to certain fiqh issues, in relation to certain different fiqh issues and whatnot. More recently, for example, historical issues, wars, right? Wars and battles and whatnot. Now in the contemporary world, okay, now we go back to the sira as for trying to understand our relationship to other communities and other what I've already mentioned, basically.
I think one of the main things that the Prophet ﷺ brought, I think, were two things, and you mentioned that in the book, where the shift, where he provided actually new language and new wording. So what is
Yes,
the
yes.
importance of that in this case, and what are
So
some
very good.
examples of that the Prophet ﷺ used in terms of
Mhm.
strategy?
Okay, that's a good question. So one of the essential attributes of a liberatory philosophy that is grounded in a radically autonomous worldview, which is the condition of liberation, is that it furnishes a new language. Why is this important? Because language is always a tool of manipulation and subversion. Okay, so for example, one of the ways in which liberalism maintains its hegemony is it has a certain language. It maintains a certain language. When it says freedom, it means something. When it says the individual, it means something. When it says woman, it means something. When it says man, so this was the same thing in Quraysh. When Quraysh said Allah or Rabb or Ilah, it had a certain signification, it had a certain meaning, right? Now, Tawheed, the Quran, radically redefined these certain key terms. Sorry, radically redefined certain words, and then it created its own semantic field. So it emphasized certain keywords, and it created its own semantic field. So, for example, the word Allah, Rabb, Ilah, Nabuwa, and so forth.
Rahman,
And it introduced
Taghut, Ar-Rahman,
Taghut,
Taghut.
exactly, Taghut, Jahiliyyah, and so forth. Ilah, what does it mean to be an Ilah? What does it mean to be a Rabb, and so forth. So this is one of, I would say, it would go as far as say one of the even miraculous, not in terms of ijaz, but one of the features, one of the amazing features of the Quran is that it was able to furnish this new language. And this is why, this again, one of the reasons that it was this is one of the essential way, this was necessary for the Prophet to cultivate a new movement, right? Because when the Prophet is, for example, if your understanding of Allah is that he's one idol among other idols, and you go to your community and you're talking about Allah, then obviously you are not cultivating a new structure, you are not a new religion, and so forth. But when you have a philosophy, and when you have a narrative, a discourse, a Quranic discourse, which fundamentally redefines these words, right, and gives them a certain place in discourse, right, then naturally it's a liberatory language. So this is why, for example, the word Allah in Quraysh was, as a name, it was, of course, it meant something different than the way we understand in the Quran, but it was also it was not, it had a secondary, more marginal place in the semantic field of the prevailing language of the time. So what the Quran does, again, created a semantic field, and it centers the name Allah in that semantic field. And then around that semantic field, you have other key terms, which you mentioned: Taghut, Jahiliyyah, Ilah, Rabb, Nabuwa, and so Risala, and so forth.
It creates a subtle change that it's almost like we don't notice. And I think one of the main things you mentioned in one of your podcasts was power is the ability to be the normal. And the Prophet ﷺ made these words the norm. Like these words became
Exactly,
so normal we
exactly.
don't
Yes,
realize it.
yes, 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 exactly, exactly.
And I think the second thing the Prophet ﷺ did was he shifted the priorities. Like there's a hierarchy, and you speak about it in the hierarchy of reality that you have, and how he shifted this hierarchy of reality of akhirah versus dunya, al hayat al dunya, and al
Yeah.
baqiyat salihat, and the split. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So okay, one of the things that the Quran cultivates, right, through the Prophet, is redefining the way in which we understand the dunya. And why is this important? Because if you look at every oppressive narrative structure, it ultimately finds its legitimization in the dunya, in confining itself and recognizing the absolute nature of the dunya. Because when you recognize that the dunya is absolute, right, then naturally all hierarchies will become naturally you will begin to form idols, because you will not find your legitimacy in any way anywhere beyond the dunya. So the nation becomes an idol, the individual becomes an idol, capital becomes an idol, Azza wal Manat become an idol, the elite of Quraysh become idols, and so forth. So the Quran begins, one of the things that the Quran does, especially in Mecca through the Prophet, is it changes our understanding of the dunya from being something that is absolute and an end in and of itself, which is the prevailing commitment of secularism today, to something that is transitory, something that is something that's ephemeral, like something that is in a state of annihilation and fana, and so forth. Something that on its own is not legitimate, something that on its own is lowly, right? Something that on its own, uh, the dunya, right, draws man away from God, right? So the Quran differentiates. So that's what the Quran redefines the dunya as such. And then the Quran also defines this idea of al-alam, which is the cosmos. And for the cosmos is different because Allah speaks of the cosmos as being the cosmos, the word, because the word alam means sign, as being the totality of creation which points to God. So what the Quran tries to do is it tries to make us understand the dunya as being part of an alam, that the dunya is not uh, that the dunya is not the final end, but that the dunya is part of a alam. It is part of a cosmos that that is grounded in the creative will of God, in the lordship of God, in the creatorship of God, and as such, this radically changes the way we understand the dunya. Right? We begin to see certain things as signs of God and not ends in and of themselves. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, capital. Um, and so forth, right? Different things. Man, the individual, right? The um, uh, the prevailing political order, right, and so forth. The natural order.
Mm-hmm. Uh, so I like all the concepts that we've spoke about, and I'm trying to tie all of them together for like for the college student today, right? I'm trying to connect all of them and trying to, okay, how does this understanding of what we have built today, in terms of Islamic liberation and Islamic liberation theology, contribute to the activism of the college student, and how does it put, like, what reasoning does it give them to actually be an activist as a part of their deen, as a part of it's a part of this liberatory project that is inherently, it's so inherent in our deen.
Yes. So two things. First of all, we need to reclaim what we understand by Islam, and we need to reclaim what we understand by Tawheed. So these are the first two things,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is the first thing. The second thing is, as you know, you guys as students, you need to begin to say like, okay, what are challenges and issues and narratives that are prevailing on my college campus or on at the national level and at the local level. So the leftist discourse narrative and its set of issues, the right wing populism that is also prevailing on certain college campuses. So beginning to understand, like, okay, Tawheed as a philosophy and as a movement, how does it address these different philosophy, these different narratives? Now, so for example, one of the key things to do would be to try to understand what these philosophies are, right? Their history, their internal contradictions, and so forth, and then understand. So, for example, if you want to engage in a critique of liberalism's understanding of the individual, right? That would require that you immerse yourself in in their narrative, in their discourse, in their literature, and of course in the prevailing the popular opinion and culture. It's not enough to read John Locke. You have to see what's being said, the discourse in media and in mainstream culture and whatnot. So you engage in an internal critique of for example, liberalism on the individual, for example. But you must also give an alternative. You must say like, okay, this is the Quranic understanding of the individual. Same thing with gender. We understand what is gender. We must come to understand what are the internal contradictions of the understanding of gender in the leftist discourse. And then we need to understand, okay, what is the Quranic understanding of gender, right? And in doing so, it is not enough for us to go back to literature that was written in the Muslim world in the 1920s, 1930s, which is not to say that, oh, Islam evolved or something, or, you know, we must adapt to modern times. No, because the issues have changed, the challenges have changed. So I would say this is the task right now at hand for Muslims on college campuses.
So it's almost like da'wah. You need to like understand who you're talking to and what their idea is, so you can be able to create
Yes,
it, and then provide that alternative. And this would go
yes,
for the same, for example, for capitalism and how capitalism has become the norm. we
Yeah.
critique it, and then we provide the Islamic alternative of that, and so is the same for the left.
Yes.
I think we're an hour in, so I mean, alhamdulillah, there's a lot to digest here, and I want to rather open it for a Q&A. So I want to open it for a Q&A and see what are some of the questions
Okay.
the students have to ask. So I'm unable to see it. It's pretty far. Question. Okay, so one of the questions are: would you say that the academic methodologies, such as the historical critical method, is part of the oppressive philosophy?
Okay. So this is a good question. Um, the historical critical method emerged. It had a complicated history, right? When we want to understand certain aspects, especially of academia, we can't understand it in a linear way. Like, oh, you had a secular philosophy and you had some secularist philosopher who was like, oh, I hate religion, so I'm going to come up with something called the historical critical method. A historical critical method as originally, in many ways, emerged right from a certain relationship, from a certain engagement with Christian discourse, biblical discourse, right, and Christian narratives, and it was very creative in doing so. The historical critical method, and it was positive in doing so. So, and there's a lot that we can learn and glean from the historical critical method, which is essentially that it is critical, right? It is critical of it tells the thinker, right, the academic, what have you, to be critical of dogma, okay, critical of a certain culture that was prevalent in um, seminaries and biblical discourse and whatnot. um, that being said, um, as it evolved, yes, even from its origins, but as it evolved even more, yes, of course, it is grounded in a certain secular narrative, which is, of course, and that's precisely why they were critical of Christianity and critical of biblical discourse. But historical critical method does not commit itself to a certain secular ideology, right? Um, uh, it is very ambiguously a secular, more of a secular culture that prevails in certain academic circles across universities and certain departments and whatnot. But it does not have a coherent, maybe in certain, of course, in certain institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, the secular narrative is more thought out and more structured and coherent and whatnot. Um, Now, in understanding Islam and the Quran, using the historical critical method and understanding the Quran, this is a problem because we should not feel and we should not have this inferiority where we feel we are beholden to academia, as though academia has some sort of superiority to the Muslim community and the Muslim intellectual, as if the historical critical method is the legitimate and the ultimate method of understanding our own texts, understanding our own tradition and what have you. Now, so then what's the alternative? Well, here Muslim academics and Muslim scholars, and this is happening today, right, in Turkey and whatnot, especially, for example, in Turkey and across in some parts of the Arab world, is having our own method, drawing on our tradition and understanding the Quranic text in relation to certain contemporary modern problematics and so forth.
So um, okay, so there's another question here saying, what is the prevailing system and hegemony that keeps
Right?
being mentioned?
What is
What is this prevailing system and hegemony that keeps being mentioned?
so it of course it's different. So when we speak of a hegemonic order, we are not referring to a particular order because different orders emerge in different historical periods, different historical epochs, and different geographies. Okay, now in my opinion, right, the prevailing hegemonic order today is neoliberalism and global liberal culture. global neoliberal culture and what have you, precisely because it not only shapes our it has not only subverted politics and economics to its design, right, and its philosophy, but it has also come to dominate mainstream language, discourse, and culture, trends, styles, what we determine to be what we determine to be important, and what we determine to be not of importance, and so forth. So, in my opinion, that now, of course, there are other hegemonic oppressive orders in the Muslim world, for example, authoritarian structures and whatnot. Um, and then now, in the United States, obviously, with the emergence of the right wing and Donald Trump becoming president, and now the whole anti-immigration movement and the crackdowns that are to come, right? This is also a hegemonic oppressive order, which also requires its own um, engagement. That we also have to engage with this order.
So I think you mentioned neoliberalism a lot, and how do you define neoliberalism, and
So
how it's
neoliberalism,
different than
mm,
liberalism?
so neoliberalism is the ultimate and radical expression of capitalism, which is the absolute autonomy, right, or severing the economic, the market, from the political, from the collective. And when we say the political, essentially, what do we mean by that? Originally, the political in the 1960s, 1970s in the US, for example, it meant the collective, the community, and there was a certain understanding of the good life and certain virtues, regardless of whether we agree with them or not. Now, what neoliberalism does is it says, okay, and this understanding of the good life in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up until maybe even up until the 90s, the market was never independent. It was never disassociated with the good life, with the collective, with the political community. Now, neoliberalism, and through capitalism and the neoliberalism, is it completely severs the political from the market, and then it subverts the political to the market.
Mm.
So the individual culture becomes defined by the market. And this is, for example, if we look at consumerism, the consumer culture, we look at uh, the type of material that is coming out, the type of discourse that is coming out on streaming, Netflix, Hulu, and all that stuff, social media. We can see precisely how the market has subverted politics. It comes to define what is politics, right? Its own arbitrary understanding of politics, and the way in which we engage with politics and engage with other individuals, and with the state and so forth.
Okay, so I think um, one of the biggest, and this is one of the biggest questions that we have, and this is a question that keeps being asked. It seems to be a common trend when speakers come in, um, and it says perhaps one of the biggest challenges to language creation strategy is the elitist academic vocabulary used in such discussions. Um, and it seems like we have an issue with language creation as we stand today. So, do you have any idea on how we can build that and work on one start?
Okay, so that's a very good question, and this is something that I personally struggled with when I was doing my graduate studies, and when I was doing my. So I had this problem because on the one hand, off campus, I was engaged with Islamic movements, and there was a certain language, and then in academia, another graduate studies, there was another language. So I think one of the problem is that up until now, up until the contemporary age, there has been a gap between the scholarly community, right, the traditional scholarly community, the ulama, the students of knowledge, on the one hand, right, who draw on the Quran and the Sunnah and so forth, and then you have the Muslim intellectuals and the Muslim academics, who in and of themselves have their own challenges, right, because most of them are subservient to academic discourse and so secular academic discourse. What we need to do is we need to marry that. There needs to be a synthesis, an engagement between the two, between the scholarly community and between the Muslim academic world. And I'd say the biggest burden falls on the Muslim academic world, and Muslim students in academia, because we are more intimately familiar with the language and the internal contradictions and the origins and the inconsistencies of academic discourse, right? And and it is only in understanding the internal contradictions and the philosophy and the narratives and the grounds of legitimacy of academic discourse, that we can begin to say, okay, so this is what we are not. So let's talk about what we are. Let's go back to the Quran, right, and try to articulate our own understanding, our own understandings, our own academic language. So, for example, and this is something that's being done. So, for example, Hiba Azat Ra'uf, right, trying to understand what is Umran in the Quran. What is Umran? Uh, Other Muslim academics, for example, Ibn Khaldun University, and so forth, uh, beginning to understand what is man. Taha Abdul Rahman in Morocco, for example, what is ruh, what is al-insan, what is dunya, and so forth. So this is a project that's already begun to. Uh, we have already begun to see its fruition in the Arab world. In the Muslim world, in the the Muslim West, it's still, I say it's still in its infantile phase.
So, um, I think one of the main things about languages is that we can take it as it is in Arabic, or we could make it in English in a way that it becomes the norm, because Arabic is so difficult to make
Yeah,
normal. If you use the words like taghut, for example, and I think one
yeah,
of the main books you used in your book is second creator. It's not something that we really hear about usually. It's not
yeah.
the wording is the phrase is not really familiar. Would you say
Yeah,
that as
again,
an
just
example,
to
for
clarify,
example?
this is not my term. I got this from Sherman B. Jackson,
Okay.
who is far more, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a far greater intellectual stature than I am.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, this is, for example, what I mean by introducing our own vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
our own discourse, by creatively formulating and redefining certain terms and certain, especially key terms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, Another question we have here is, how can we learn from Islamic movements to allow the masses to understand the depth of these concepts? What is the role of the
Very good.
Islamic movement in understanding these concepts?
Okay, so this is a good question, because um, unfortunately, this is another gap, right? There's always been a gap between the Muslim global north and the Muslim global south. So you had all these Islamic movements emerging across the Muslim global south, and then you had the Muslim diaspora, and now second, third, third generation of Muslims in the West that are not intimately aware or have no knowledge of these movements. One of the reasons is, of course, there's a language barrier, right? And another is that for them it was not of primary importance. There's no need to look at these Islamic movements; they were irrelevant to the needs of Muslims in the U.S. That's changing today, because now the culture is global. The situation is different. Politics is in the West is changing. It's becoming more problematic for Muslims in the West. So I would say what we can learn from them is that we can obviously go back to their culture, right? Their concepts, the philosophies and ideas that they formulated. But we can also we can also look at um, uh, the experience, their experience, right? So what were their pitfalls? What were what can we learn from their strategies? Um, how did the Muslim world respond to these movements at the time? So basically, we can look at it from so we can learn from their failures, and we learn from their success.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay. So, another question that we have here is didn't Quraysh think that um didn't Quraysh think that Allah was another idol? Like, didn't they know He was the ultimate God, but used the idols as a means to get as a means to get to Allah? It was like like it was almost like shirk. And how does
So
this
in
affect the language? How did the language come in and affect this?
so okay, so keep in mind that Quraysh, the there are different understandings of Allah among different tribes in Arabian Peninsula, Ta'if, Yathrib, Mecca, and so forth. So, for example, in some Qurayshi traditions, right, Allah was the supreme God, but there were certain demigods that mediated the relationship between the community and Allah, right? And of course, Allah was subservient, and they had their own understanding of Allah. whether he was ultimate, whether he had any lordship and sovereignty in relation to man, and so forth. Now, what the Quran does is it redefines our understanding of Allah and Ilah, right? And then it grounds Allah in the center of our semantic field. So, and and this is something that I believe we addressed earlier.
Um, so another questions, another question that we have here is, so this concept feels very like very new. Is this something that how is this something that we got from the Sahaba and the Prophet Salam, like this understanding of
Mhm.
Tawheed? Has there been like a misunderstanding in the past, or what does this like why is this something new that we're being introduced to here? Why does it feel new?
Okay, so of course, this is something that we can glean from the lives of the Sahaba. Now, the problem, so the problem is this: that generally, when we think about when we think about the Prophet and the companions, right? We draw on traditional literature, right? Which because of it, because which is the product of its own time. Okay, whereas in the contemporary world, there's different issues. So we do not have a tradition of the Sirah or a literature about the companions that can allow us to understand certain uh, contemporary issues. So, for example, understanding what does it mean, what is the virtues of a Sahabi, uh, what does it mean to be like a Sahabi in an age of uh, consumerism, right? What are some of the the virtues of Uthman or Abu Bakr in relation to wealth, for example, uh, in terms of, and so forth. So we can definitely learn from the Sahaba, but we have to read it through a certain lens. And I want to stress something that this does not mean that, oh, okay, Islam evolved, Islam has to adapt to modern times. Not at all. What it means is that we have to go back to our tradition, our rich tradition, and the Quran and the Sunnah to understand certain key issues rather than forcing Islam to conform to the dominant discourse on these issues. For example, the left and the right.
Mhm. Um, and then think we'll take one last question, and this one is actually about justice, adl. What
Yes,
does where does adl stand in all of this, within the Islamic liberatory
excellent. Okay,
project?
very good. So al-adala in the Quran. This is beautifully articulated by Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas, who I recommend everyone become familiar with. Al-adala in the Quran, the justice, does not refer to a static Platonic ideal that exists in the abstract. Al-adala is the state in which everything is put in its proper order. So the Quran, and as Muslims, we understand that there is an order, right? There is a kawn, there is the cosmos, and everything has its place in the cosmos. The family, the individual, Allah Azza wa Jal, nature, the state, and so forth. Al-adala is the state in which a thing is in its proper place in that order, which for us is the cosmic order, al-alam. Okay, so so in concrete, in a liberatory sense, this means that the individual ought to understand his relationship and to understand. So as an individual or as a community, um, uh, to understand our relationship to, let's say, I don't know, the American nation or whatever, we we ought to understand our relationship, our place in the grand cosmic order, which is al-alam, and this means understanding our relationship to Allah, which is ubudiyya, understanding our relationship to nature and other communities, which is al-istikhlaf, our stewardship, understanding our relationship to ourselves, right, tazkiyah and whatnot, um, and muraqaba, right, constantly doing muraqaba and so forth and so forth. So this is adala. It's understanding the proper place of a thing within an order, which in our case is understanding our place in the divine, in the cosmic totality of things.
Yeah. uh, no, jazakallah khair. There's this
So yeah,
one question that is interesting. If we could take one more.
sure,
So
sure.
on one of your on one of the podcasts, you said that not engaging in politics is a political decision. Could you
Mhm.
expand on that?
Yeah. So look, at the end of the day, right? There's always going to be a dominant and dominant political language, discourse, system, right? And there's going to be counter oppositional movements and whatnot. So politics is that's the first thing, right? We cannot escape that. We don't live in a world where there is no prevalent political discourse and we just live as anarchist political independent communities, what have you. Now, that's first thing. Second thing is politics is intimately involved in our day-to-day lives, right? Across, and same thing with our whether it's our social, our transactions, um, our understanding of key issues, right? Key values, and so forth. Now, when you don't engage with these issues and you don't have your own narrative, then you are going to be appropriated and absorbed into another narrative. So, and this is what's happening, right? Because we as Muslims don't have our own political narrative, our own politics, naturally we're being absorbed into one of two camps. So you find Muslims split. Now one has to go to the left and another has to go to the right because we don't have our own politics.
So it's almost like we're assuming it's a position of neutrality. Like
Yes.
not engaging politics is neutral, but it really is
Yes.
not, because then
There's no such thing as neutrality.
Mhm.
Yes.
It's submitting to like the status quo in a sense.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Jazakallah khair for coming on.
Well,
Like
yeah,
we deeply appreciate this as the Muslim community on campus.
it is my pleasure.
These are topics that are very they're very new, and we really need them because they come and they shape our understanding of our activism.
It
Sometimes,
is my honor to be with you guys.
alhamdulillah, wallah, we look at this and we're like, why do we do this? And then we refer to the material and then the content that you provide and many of the academics, alhamdulillah,
Barakallahu
provide.
feek.
Is there anything that you want to add before
No,
before we end
alhamdulillah. I
this?
mean, I mean, for a deeper exploration of the themes I talked about, I discussed them in my book, Against the World, and you can refer to my website asharfouch.com, where I write about these issues. Other than that, people can feel free to reach out to me um, anytime, inshallah ta'ala, and I would be more than helped to be at service to the community.
Yeah, inshallah, we'll add the website and the link to the book, which is Against the World,
Yes.
in the link. Is there anything else you want us to refer to?
No, no, that's
Okay.
that's all. Barakallahu
All
feek.
right. Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum,
Barakallah
brother.
feek. Jazakallah khair for coming on.
Wa iyyakum. Assalamu
All
alaikum.
right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.